You are listening to the Global Greek Influence podcast, and I'm your founder and host, Panagiota Pimenidou, pioneering the future with leading experts in technology, science, and innovation. The EU's future global significance is deeply intertwined with its progress in technology, science, and innovation. These drive competitiveness, address global challenges, enhance geopolitical influence, fuel economic growth, improve quality of life, and necessitate adaptive policies. Leadership in these areas is crucial for the EU to maintain its standing in a changing world. Today, we have a distinguished guest joining us to delve into some of the most pressing issues facing the European Union. Yannis Karamitsios is a lawyer from Greece who has been working as a legal officer for the European Commission since 2006. Prior to this, he served with the OSCE, which is the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, as a human rights and election officer in various Balkan countries. However, for our discussion today, we are speaking with him in his capacity as an active member of the European Federalist movement. Yannis is a founding member of Alliance for Europe, an organization dedicated to promoting European unity and values. He is also the author of the insightful book Time for a European Federation, which proposes the creation of a federal sovereign European state. To hear more engaging guests and unique perspectives on current and timeless issues, please subscribe, like, and leave your comments on the Global Greek Influence podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and Facebook. You can also subscribe to my YouTube channel, Yota Pimenidou. Follow me on X at global_Greek and on TikTok at the Innovation Catalyst. Yannis, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you for being here with us today. Let's start with looking into the idea of a federal Europe, which has resurfaced in recent political discourse, often framed as a potential evolution of the current European Union structure. This concept, drawing parallels with federal states like the United States or Germany, envisions a more integrated political entity with shared sovereignty across member states. Recent debates surrounding greater EU integration, particularly in areas like defense and economic policy, have brought the notion of federalism back into the spotlight. Public and political opinions on this are deeply divided, with proponents arguing for increased efficiency and global influence, while opponents raise concerns about the erosion of national sovereignty and democratic accountability. What is the core concept of a federal Europe? Is there space for national identities? Would it create more equity?
The idea of a European Federation started already after the First World War. At that time, it was basically the British intellectuals and British political activists who pushed for that idea, namely to heal Europe from the wounds of the First World War. That went hand in hand with the line of global federalism. And also the Society of Nations was created at that time. Then this idea was revived after the Second World War. Alberto Spinelli, an Italian activist and resistant fighter against Germany, was the most prominent figure of that idea. It consisted of the notion of bringing Europe together to ensure peace within the continent, but also to help the continent stand on its feet and compete with the rest of the world. So the rest is history. We have since then the formation of the European communities in the 50s, which then led to the expansion of the members of those communities from 6 up to 27 as they stand today. And also it led to the expansion of the competencies of those communities. At the beginning, the competence was very narrow. It was just focusing on the creation of a common market and a common customs union. But over time, people realize that economic cooperation is not enough. What you also need is to cooperate in the areas of energy, environment, rule of law, governance. So as a result, the most crucial step, in my view, came in 1992 with the Maastricht Treaty when the European Union was established. So it was not a European Economic Community anymore. It was a union of sovereign states, which are still sovereign. However, they surrendered a big part of their sovereignty to a supranational structure. And this structure is the European Union as we know it today. So if you ask me the question, has the idea of European federalism succeeded or not so far? I would say yes. I would say that already approximately 60% we are all federalized, in the sense that 60% of national legislations in each member state are basically a transposition of European Union law. We have common policies in the majority of critical issues, like, as I said before, environment, internal market, trade, negotiations with international partners, also in several areas of justice, rule of law, and so on. So what we as European federalists want to achieve as a realistic first step is to ensure more integration within the current structure of the European Union. However, as we have witnessed recently, out of global challenges that occurred for the first time in our generation, at least even in history, 27 individual member states cannot compete or stand alone anymore in the global scene. We got the pandemic of 2020, where we realized that we cannot tackle the challenges of COVID alone. We ordered vaccines altogether. We borrowed altogether for the first time in history 750 billion euros in order to achieve the recovery after the pandemic crisis. And then, of course, we got the Russian aggression of 2022 against Ukraine. That gave a very, very grave signal to all of us that we need to come together also in the area of defense and security. So the next federalism move is definitely to integrate also those policies within the existing EU structures, like to make defense an European Union competence, also to make immigration an EU competence, full EU competence, because as we have also witnessed since the last decade, it is very difficult for a few member states alone to absorb so many immigrants and also to apply the appropriate immigrant policies. So for this reason, we also propose that it is time for the creation of a European Federation. A European Federation in the sense that member states surrender also their full sovereignty. They become part members of a federal sovereign structure, like the United States of America. We can create the United States of Europe. But within that structure, it doesn't mean that they will give up all of their national competencies. Federalism is not about centralizing all powers in Brussels or in Strasbourg. Federalism is about assigning the right competencies to the right level. When it comes to the big global issues like trade, defense, immigration, tackling climate crisis, in all those big areas, we will need a joint governance. We will need a true government with an executive body and a legislative body where we all European people together will tackle the issues in common. However, when it comes to issues that have to do with national or regional identities, there, of course, the members of this federation, the national members of this federation, will retain their competencies. For instance, in the case of education, the Greek schools or the French schools or the Polish schools will keep their own curriculum. They will teach their own history to the children. Of course, these countries will use their official languages. They will also keep competence in the areas of culture, in the areas of local environmental protection, for instance, in the management of local infrastructure. They will keep all of their flags, all of their emblems. Whatever makes a Greek feel Greek, it should be retained. Same with the Polish, the Bulgarians, the French, the Spanish, and so on. Even the countries that have a king, for instance, they can keep their kings and queens as ceremonial leaders because they are connected to their national history. However, as I said before, on issues of global importance, of global scale, I don't think it is possible anymore for the structures of European sovereign states as they stand today that it will be possible for them to really address the big challenges of our century. If you look at the global map, you will see that Europe consists of many mini states. The figures are really striking. Even the most populous country of Europe, European Union, which is Germany today with 80 million people, at global scale is not even one of the top 10 most populous countries. And by 2050, none of the European states alone will belong to the top 10 economies of the world. However, altogether, we will be at least the second economy of the world, according to today's figures. We will have the second strongest armed forces in the world. We will have the third biggest population in the world. So that will really make Europe a global power, a global competitor. It is already a very big power, maybe the top power in terms of trade and economic relations. European Union today is a top trading partner of at least 80 countries around the world. It's much more relevant to them than the United States or China. So all this global power that we have, all this effect that our policies have at the global scene, at the European Sovereign Federation will also get a geopolitical character. We will also be able to project hard power, not only soft power. We will have a say on every corner of the planet. We will be a major bloc in the global security architecture. And I think this is something that we need in order to ensure freedom and prosperity of our people. Otherwise, we might become irrelevant in terms of geopolitics. We might be easily attacked by rising authoritarian countries like Russia or like Turkey in the south. And I think it is both realistic and necessary that we move towards this step.
So many things I would like to touch upon, Yanni. Allow me to take off many hats and put as many other hats on today. When I look into the European integration, as currently in the form of the European Union, despite common policy, still I see fragmented developments in regard, for instance, to transitioning to a new energy economy. So far, and even before the COVID pandemic, even before the invasion of Russia to Ukraine, the European Union foreign policy was and still is ignoring the fact that Turkey occupies almost a third of Cyprus, which is a European Union member state. Yet we see countries like Poland insisting on inviting Turkey to support European defense, as if Turkey has not already declared a casus belli for over 2 decades to another EU member state, which is Greece. So we see this disjointment in terms of a common vision. And in my opinion, what is crucial for European Federation is for all Europeans that consist today's several EU member states to have a common vision. So we cannot only see that, for instance, the EU is threatened by Russia, but not by Turkey, because in the case of Poland, worrying that Russia might invade the same country as they did to Ukraine, while the European Union policy is supporting the new Al-Jolani government in Syria, which is backed by Turkey, and actually the troops that gave the power to Al-Jolani were mainly Turkish paratroopers. So we have to recognize that at some point, the European Union member states should have an equally common vision for a European Federation to take place.
This is true, but I would reverse the argument. I would say that currently we do have different visions exactly because we are not a sovereign federal state, and exactly because defense and external relations and security in general is not an exclusive competence of the European Union. For this reason, everybody retains his or her own priorities when it comes to foreign policy. For this reason, Cyprus and Greece obviously are more concerned about Turkey than Russia, while the Baltic states vice versa, and Poland as well. If we were altogether a sovereign state, I would like to emphasize, to highlight the term sovereign, then there will be no question that Turkey occupies a territory of this sovereign superpower. Turkey will have inevitably to withdraw its troops from Cyprus. Turkey will not dare to dispute the right of this sovereign state to expand its maritime nautical miles to 12 instead of 6, as it is today in the Aegean Sea. Turkey will not dare to put in doubt the sovereign rights of this union in East Mediterranean and the Aegean Sea. And of course, will not dare to introduce any threats also on the land borders. It will not dare to use immigrants as a weapon of hybrid war. It will not dare to intimidate the to intimidate the people of the islands and doubt our right to establish even military bases or troops on our sovereign islands. All these things that Turkey is doing today against Greece or Cyprus, I think would be unimaginable if Greece and Cyprus were part of this European sovereign state. And to go to a larger maybe scale, if we were a sovereign state, I believe Russia will not dare to invade Ukraine. And of course, it will not dare to continue with its hybrid war against Finland, the Baltics, Poland, and the rest. Russia would be a dwarf, a military dwarf, compared to the European Federal Armed Forces, Turkey as well. At the same time, we would have much higher leverage in the Middle East. Today, we are almost irrelevant in the Middle East as Europeans. No matter whether we recognize the Jolani regime governance or not in Syria, I don't think it makes much difference to the Syrian people or Syrian politics or the Middle East politics. But if we were the second greatest power in the world and actually very close to the Middle East, all of our interventions in the case of Gaza or Syria or Lebanon or the Gulf states would have much, much higher impact on all of them. So in order to reverse the argument, you say we need a common vision in order to establish a common federation. I will go the other way. It's a chicken and egg thing. The establishment of a common federation would force all of us to have the same vision, because this is what happened already before with the economic union and the customs union and with our environmental policies. And because all of our leaders had to sit together in the same room every month deciding about legislation on each one of those topics, a common culture and a common political vision was shaped inevitably over time. We even created our own political tradition, which is unique in the world.
You actually touched upon one of the areas I wanted us to discuss in terms of the current EU's relevance at the global stage. Let's see what will be left until that point to further discuss. Now, moving on to the current European Union landscape, particularly the current leadership within the European Union, which faces a complex landscape of geopolitical challenges and internal divisions. And of course, this is also at the center of discussion about the future trajectory of European integration. Recent initiatives aimed at strengthening EU-level cooperation in areas like defense procurement and energy security can be interpreted by some as steps, however incremental, towards greater federalization. Significant hurdles remain, including differing national interests and varying levels of public support for deeper integration across member states. Identifying potential key actors who could drive a more federalist agenda requires an analysis of the current political landscape, considering the influence of key member states, the European Commission, the European Parliament, and influential political movements and think tanks. Can the current EU leadership promote a federal Europe? Who could be the key actors?
Europe is commonly accused of lack of leadership, and also is accused of lacking charismatic leaders. We can define leadership at two levels, institutional and personal. Institutionally speaking, European Union will have to move in its current pace, more or less, because it's, as you said before, a fragmented continent. It's in terms of states, cultures, languages. We will need complicated discussions and consensus on many difficult topics, which is not easy or fast to achieve. For this reason, the leadership of all those institutions will need to be pragmatic. Doesn't have to be spectacular, but it will have to be really realistic and down to earth. Because to give a small example to our audience, we have now the leadership of the European Commission, which is the executive arm, but not a government. We have the leadership of the European Parliament, which is one of the two legislative bodies. And we have the leadership of the European Council, which is the other legislative body that represents the European governments. All these three institutions, together with many individual significant players in the continent, will have to reach consensus after laborious discussions, after laborious negotiations on many difficult topics. So it is not very easy to identify the one sole leader who will make the big difference. We don't have the presidential system of the United States or Russia, or we don't have the authoritarian system of China, where you will have the one single leader who will be the personification of the national policies. We will have to, our model is completely different. It's much more democratic. It's much more inclusive. It will have to build on negotiations. This is both a setback. It is not very flexible and it is not very efficient on one hand. On the other hand, it leads to much more solid results and results with greater democratic legitimacy. So it is difficult to find a charismatic or a single leader among all of them, simply because our system is like this today. However, if we move to a European federation with a sovereign structure, then it will be much easier to identify the sole president of this federation or the sole foreign minister of this federation or defense minister, who will have much clearer responsibilities on the major policies. And those single persons will be the ones that will really represent the union to the world. And on the basis of the performance of those persons, we can determine whether the leadership is adequate or not.
I would go as far as asking you, how would these ministers of the European Federation be elected, on a federal basis? But then when choosing a government for federal Europe, then wouldn't at least at the beginning the dynamics be leaning towards the largest contributors of the previous EU?
Not necessarily. I mean, inevitably, the European government of the future federation will have to be elected by direct elections, popular elections. People of European Union will elect their parliament as they do today. The members of the parliament more or less will represent proportionally the population of each member state. And then those members of that parliament will elect the respective government. The government, which might consist of several political parties in the form of coalition, because it will be very difficult to have a single party government within such a big space like a European Union with many diverse origins of people and their representatives. So that government will have its president. He will serve a term of 4 years or 5 years, depending on what people decide, what the constitution decides, together with the European Parliament. At the same time, as Americans have the Senate, here we will have the EU Council as it works today. We can call it second chamber or Senate, where you will have the representatives of the governments of the national states, because still it will be a federation of states. So the national states will still need to be represented in the government of the European Federation. So we will have one chamber, one hand, it will be the European Parliament. The other chamber will be the Senate or the Council, call it whatever, representing the states. They together will give the vote of confidence to the government of the European Federation. And this government of the European Federation will have the distinct leaders, the president of the government, the ministers, and so on. As I said before, most probably, and following the political tradition that we developed already, those governments will be coalition governments because they will have to be as inclusive as possible. And they will represent the main ideological or political trends of each time. This is democracy.
Before I move on to my following question, Yanni, I wanted to ask you, how popular is the concept, the idea of a federal Europe across current political parties within the European Parliament?
Not very popular, but more popular than before. So the parties around the center are obviously more friendly to this idea. Very few of them dare come forward to call for the creation of a sovereign federal state. But already within the European Parliament, the members of the European Parliament, there is a caucus of a group of delegates called the Spinelli Group. It's MEPs, members of the European Parliament from many different parties, who themselves advocate the idea of a federal Europe. This Spinelli Group consists of people both from the center right and the center left. And of course, the center, they also include ecologists. They're from the Green Party. They also include members from the left also. So I would say the idea is not is not supported by the majority of the delegates, but there is a core that pushes for a European Federation, or at least for policies that push Europe in this direction.
The escalating tensions between major global powers, particularly the evolving dynamics between the United States, China, and Russia, are forcing the European Union to confront its strategic positioning in the international arena. The traditional stance of neutrality or non-alignment, often advocated by some member states, is increasingly being questioned as the lines between competing blocs become more defined. Recent debates surrounding the war in Ukraine and the EU's response have highlighted the limitations of a purely neutral stance. Public and political discourse is increasingly focused on the need for the EU to develop a stronger and more unified foreign and security policy. With the increasing polarization between global powers, the EU's neutrality could no longer be a realistic possibility, and it might be destined to take sides in a coming conflict? Is the EU sleepwalking into a war it is ill prepared for?
Yes, I think so. There is an argument that if we keep rearming ourselves, if we keep talking about war, especially with Russia, it's like creating a self-fulfilled prophecy. So at the end of the day, we might ourselves, through a kind of escalation of armaments or escalation of our stance against Russia, provoke the war on our own. But I support the opposite side. I believe that a war might be more likely if we don't do so. If we do not contain Russia, or if we do not contain Turkey, if we follow a passive stance, if we start accepting the fait accompli of what Russia, as fait accompli of what Russia is doing in Ukraine, or of what Turkey is doing in Cyprus or on the Mediterranean Sea, sooner or later, these powers and other powers too will sense our weakness. They will be emboldened, and then they will move to the next step. And the next step will be a more aggressive policy in many different forms, either through a hybrid war or through a real war. So it is in the interest of Europe to develop further its defense forces, and most important, to integrate them better, because we already spend a lot. We already spent 2% of our collective GDP. And this amount is really huge. It's really much bigger than the amount in absolute numbers of what Russia spends, for instance. However, because we are not integrated and because we don't have a common stance and a common foreign policy put in place upon our divisions, Erdogan too, they also play on the fact that our resources are scattered. They're not united, and they will not miss the opportunity for their next strike against the Baltics or Finland or some, islands of Greece, or maybe further in Cyprus when the opportunity rises. To conclude, I believed in what Roman said: if you want peace, prepare for war. Unfortunately, we will have to prepare for war. Fortunately, however, we have the resources to do so. We can also use the development of our defense industry as a kind of peace dividend, because many applications of that industry can be used also for civilian purposes. We can also strengthen our economy, strengthen internal demand for defense and security projects and products. And I think it will be wise for us to refocus our policy in this respect, at least for the next 10 years.
The European Union's economic landscape is currently shaped by a confluence of factors, including the aftermath of the pandemic, the energy crisis exacerbated by geopolitical instability, rising inflation, and the ongoing transition towards a green and digital economy. Public and political discussions across the EU are centered on ensuring long-term prosperity and competitiveness in a rapidly changing global market. Key challenges being debated include managing inflation while avoiding recession, securing sustainable energy sources, fostering innovation and technological leadership, addressing labor shortages and skills gaps, and ensuring a just transition to a climate-neutral economy. What are the key economic challenges that the EU needs to address to ensure its prosperity in the next decade?
Well, Europe will definitely need to increase its growth rates, because currently they are very low. It's at the scale of 1 to 2% per year, the best case. We, of course, have the problem of deindustrialization, as the entire Western world has, although it is not as terrible as people claim to be. We have a major problem with an aging population. So we have a demographic problem. Compared to the rest of the world, we are getting fewer and older. And this, of course, affects our overall productivity and the economy. And lately, we also have a major issue of labor shortages and shortages in skills. So in the book that I published 4 years ago, and actually I'm going to update for the second edition, I make a lot of proposals about how to rejuvenate the European economy. Definitely, we will need, if we create this federal state that I propose, inevitably a lot of internal market problems will be solved automatically. Bureaucracy will be reduced, red tape will be cut. The book proposes simpler and lower taxation, to create a lot of incentives for foreign investments in Europe, to create incentives in order to connect Europe with the growing markets of the world. For instance, there are big opportunities now in Africa and in some Asian countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Vietnam, in Southeast Asia in general, but especially in India, where we have rapidly expanding new markets, and this is an opportunity we should not miss. So we should connect with those markets in order to boost our exports, but also to boost our mutual investments. We invest there and they can also invest in us. The future is there because also the growth of population is there in the 21st century. We need to establish a mentality which I call business first. So in case of dilemma, we should always think pro-business. This is a mentality which is not strongly embedded in European culture yet, because we still have, thankfully, of course, strong social policies where there are big considerations about protecting the employees, protecting the pensioners, protecting the unemployed. On the other hand, we have to think that a society, in order to be rich, it needs wealthy and strong business. Somehow we need to shift our focus to this direction. And last but not least, I think the last is the most important thing, is to catch up with the fourth industrial revolution, which is not only artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is a major part of it, but it's also all new technologies ranging from nanotechnology to biotechnology, where there are huge leaps in terms of productivity, innovation, wealth creation. So if we want to focus our public investment in something really productive, I think this public investment should really focus on educating people on how to, first of all, take advantage of the fourth industrial revolution, and then help them establish business and develop their whole economic model on the basis of that revolution, because the opportunities are huge. The opportunities are huge also for the middle class or low class people who can much easier now today escape poverty if they take advantage of the possibilities of new technologies, like from 3D printers up to teleworking, up to connecting with partners from around the world.
You touched upon many topics, especially for reskilling workers regarding their new skills that the new economy demands. And for instance, from my experience here in Greece, I can see many unemployed people being called to be part of programs for their reskilling. And firstly, I see that the content of these trainings are not appropriate for the market. And secondly, that the Greek market has not caught up in order to demand such skilled workers. And I was wondering if this happens in other parts of the European Union, and also being part of Horizon research calls and research programs. I see this discrepancy between what we say that we want to do and by what we actually do. We have a huge bank of knowledge and IP in the European Union, yet we have an industry that relies on incentives, while the European Commission should tell the European industry, that, you know what, at some point there will be no incentives. It's you. You have to create the market. You have to create the market globally because we invested in you, especially, for instance, in Horizon programs, when we are asked to upscale a technology from proof of concept to testing and then to commercialization. And when these programs are fulfilled, I'm wondering, where are these products? We could be leaders in technology globally, yet the European industry does not really want to catch up. And then we are now thinking of having a trade deal with China. For what purpose? To keep our IP just in a written format. Yes, we have achieved these outputs scientifically, technologically, and then we would need to import from China their technology. I don't see how this really works. And even if one is really concerned about the current US government approach regarding their tariffs, still, I don't think it's an answer for the European Union to become dependent on another superpower like China, as we have come dependent for the sake of the European industries to the Russian natural gas.
Well, there are no magic answers to all this, and I'm not an expert to address all this, the issue of all of those, of each of those sectors that you mentioned. However, there is a reality we need to acknowledge, that regardless how the world is shaped in the future, each one of us will need to be dependent on somebody else in terms of international trade, knowledge, and investments. I mean, also Chinese depend on us in many respects, like the Chinese also depend on the Americans and vice versa. So we cannot achieve autarky in all areas of the economy, like energy or knowledge or manufacturing. We will need to have some trade deficits in some sectors. We will need to import even people, students or researchers from other continents. It's an open globalized world. It's a world that is getting ever closer and ever smaller. So I don't think it's bad if we depend periodically and according to the trends on other continents or countries in several sectors. However, indeed, we need to increase our local skills, our local resources, and most of it are our local business culture, as I mentioned before. And as you mentioned too. For instance, in the case of training, we will need a more realistic approach in matching training with professional and job demands in the future. There are many jobs that will be created after 10 years, and we don't even know about their existence right now. University schools, uh, university curricula and technical schools are very frequently, especially in Greece, far behind their time, the developments of their time. How to increase the skills of young people, how to find the right labor for each company, for each sector. These are things that can be achieved, in my view, through a more integrated European policy. Also in the book, I make some practical proposals how to create a kind of common employment market where people can match better their skills with the future needs. And you mentioned the fact that European industry does not want itself to adapt despite the incentives offered by the public sector. Well, I think I also write in the book that we also need to encourage private investments, not only public money, but also to create an environment where public investments and private production will take a boost. Of course, the state cannot solve all problems of the people. If some people don't want to follow some directions, it is not possible to achieve this. But if the public state, let's say the European federal state, offers low taxes, if it removes the bureaucratic hurdles, if it creates a space of coordination between a business in order for them to see who can match each other's needs in terms of labor or in terms of products. If we create some business clusters around Europe where there is some local tradition in several sectors, all these things could boost our industry. If we make, for instance, protection of intellectual property rights easier, today is very fragmented. This will also offer more incentives for industry to comply and follow the trends of the new technologies. Just a few examples on the spot. I agree with you that also the private sector needs to contribute in this collective effort.
I wish we could have more time to discuss what the current European industry could do in order to become more relevant and set the EU as a major exporter of new technologies. But I choose to go back to the leadership aspect within the European Union. The nature of leadership within the European Union has often been characterized by a focus on consensus building and technical expertise, leading to the perception of a leadership dominated by technocrats rather than charismatic figures who can capture the public imagination. Recent political developments within the EU have sparked discussions about the need for more visible and inspiring leadership to address the complex challenges facing the continent. Also, there is a desire from the public for leaders who can effectively communicate a vision for the future of Europe and mobilize public support. For our final question, Yanni, reflecting on your observations of the EU over the years, do you believe the structure of the EU allows for the emergence of charismatic leaders, or is it inherently geared towards leadership by technocrats?
Let's be frank, Europe never had charismatic leaders, I think, after the Second World War. We refer to persons like François Mitterrand or Helmut Kohl or Adenauer or de Gaulle, but they were not really charismatic. They were just, I would say, credible personalities who had a solid vision. They were very serious. They were very, I would say, professional in the way they ran politics, and most of all, reliable, but not really charismatic. And I think it is not in the nature of European people to really look for charismatic leaders, because usually charismatic leaders at the end lead the societies to unknown territories, sometimes to adventure, sometimes to war, sometimes to a kind of authoritarian environment. People, I think, deep inside are suspicious of charismatic leaders. What European people need is leaders who inspire trust, most of all, and I think that would be enough for me, at least. Maybe I speak from a very personal point of view. Charismatic leaders are usually populists. Europe does not need those populists. We have had enough of them, and all of them proved a failure. Take the populist of England, who led to Brexit at the end. Take the populist of Poland. Take the populists of Italy. None of them really gave a real way out, offer a real way out to them. I will mention the example of Emmanuel Macron today, who is much more popular outside France than inside France. And I suspect that even if he had the right to run for a third term, he might lose the next elections. So why? Because he didn't inspire trust to French people for good or bad reasons. I personally support his policies. I would vote for him if I was French, but apparently he failed to connect with them with regards to some problems that have to do with their daily lives and the basic level of quality of life. So, in conclusion, Europe, in my opinion, does not need charismatic leaders. Europe needs structures that will help it to address the challenges of this century. And these structures can only be found either within a more integrated EU regime or within the regime that I propose in the book to create a new sovereign republic. There, I think leaders will become less relevant, while the people themselves, through their representatives and through their institutions, will become much more relevant.
Yannis, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and perspectives on these critical questions facing the European Union. Your insights as a legal officer within the European Commission and as a dedicated member of the European Federalist movement have been valuable. We truly appreciate you taking the time to join us.
Thank you to Jota for inviting me. Just a last disclaimer, now I don't speak as a representative of the European Commission or Union. I only speak in my private capacity as a member of the Federalist movement. In any event, it was a great joy to speak with you.
Thank you once again, and a big thanks to our audience who stayed with us until the end of this discussion. Stay tuned for more insightful and current matter topics episodes.